We're recording.
Hi, everybody. This is Erin McNeil from Minnesota Playlist. I am joined here by the Theater of Public Policy. We're going to talk a little bit about their new Zoom performances, both what made them decide to use Zoom and also some tips for using it effectively ourselves during this time of quarantine and social distancing. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. So hi, my name is Tane Danger. I'm the co-founder and host of the Theater of Public Policy. We'll talk more about what that is probably in a second. You go nuts, Heather.
I'm Heather Meyer. I'm a performer with the Theater of Public Policy, and I do a lot of writing for the Theater of Public Policy.
So for those of you who aren't familiar with their work, typically, and tell me if I've got this wrong, but I think I've got it right, you take an issue of either like national or local importance, you bring in a specialist who gives your troupe of improvisers sort of a debrief. You guys ask them questions and kind of get to know their area of expertise, and then you do several sets of improv comedy around it. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. The only other piece is we also, we try and make sure we open it up for audience questions of that expert guest, and then that informs one more set of improv. And then I should say, since Heather's here, most of our shows usually involve like a scripted sketch that Heather puts together.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, so that makes sense. I had kind of grouped my questions for you guys into three categories. I was thinking sort of conceptual, so like why Zoom, why now? Technical, what did you use? How would you use it in the future? It sounds like you guys have several more performances on the docket using this similar system. So I'm curious, like lessons learned, things that you could impart to the rest of our community. And then I wanted to dive a little bit into the exact performance that I saw, which was, I believe, your first, which was about birds, which was fantastic and really funny. And I have several questions about how it all came together. Exactly. Big boned birds, the whole thing. It was really, really funny, and people should check it out. I'll link to it below.
Great. Well, I'll get started with sort of maybe how this came about. So as you noted, like Theater of Public Policy, we've been performing and doing these kinds of shows since 2011. And these days our home theater is the Bryant Lake Bowl. And we started our season, I want to say it was March 6th. Does that sound right, Heather?
Yeah, the first Monday of March.
The first, yeah.
March 6th seems
I think
nice.
March 6th.
9th, March 9th.
9th, 8th, one of those Mondays.
Time doesn't matter now. Yeah. FYI.
It was. I need to go on mute because my dishwasher turned on.
See, this is a thing that we learned, and we will get to in the technical part of the show, which is the magic of the mute button. So anyway, so we've been doing these shows as like live events, live theater every Monday night in the spring and the fall. And we started doing just like a regular live show at the beginning of March. And even then we started to like, all this stuff with COVID and potentially keeping people apart was starting to bubble up, but nobody really knew anything that was like going to bubble up like this at that point. And so we were talking about it, and actually, I can't remember if it was right at that start of the thing or maybe right after that first show, we were starting to get like, okay, we need a way for people who maybe don't want to come into a theater space for some period of time to be able to see the show. And at that point, we hadn't gotten to everybody has to stay at home. We hadn't even gotten to you have to stay 6 feet apart. There was some inkling of like, oh, you shouldn't have big gatherings of like a bunch of people. Which I love to just imagine that all of our shows are humongous gatherings filled with tons and tons of people. But it's enough of a thing where we were like, okay, we should have some option. So the first thing that we thought about was, well, we should be able to at least live stream the shows, which we don't normally do. So we were like, okay, that's probably pretty easy. We figure out like getting a camera and then just film it. And then that evolved over time. And actually, I'll throw it to Heather, because Heather, you were asking me sort of like early on, like when we started to get the like, okay, people need to stay 6 feet apart. People need to do X, Y, and Z, like what we might do then. And just to talk through sort of the evolution of how we got to where we got to.
Well, it evolved kind of like the situation was evolving. Originally, it was live streaming the show with no one in the audience, and we would still be doing our regular show in the theater. But as the news started evolving, having 5 improvisers, Tane, and a host and a piano player on stage is not following CDC recommendations, which is not responsible to health, nor is it responsible to the audience, because the audience's concern will be then for these, 8, 9 people on stage who are not following CDC recommendations. So then we started thinking about, again, this is like simultaneously as things are evolving, we're like, well, how do we have less people on stage and still do 6 feet apart? And then we evolved that conversation. And then as the situation nationwide elevated, it became clear that we can't be in a room. We should not. We need to be responsible for each other as performers, as artists, and also for our audience. We don't want our audience to have that concern for us watching.
Right. Yeah, and that's a really key point, because I mean, one of the reasons, and this gets to the artistic side a bit, that I love improv is because I do feel like it is a performative art where an audience really connects with the people on stage in a unique way, because they know that it is being created in real time. There's a bond I always think about between the audience and the people on stage, where it's like, we're in this thing together. And so if there's something that is distracting the audience from that sort of feeling, and it changes to, I can't be in this moment like a performance because I'm so nervous or concerned about, are they 6 feet apart? Oh my God, she touched her face, or whatever it is. Like, then they're totally like taken out of what we're trying to do. And then that's not helpful. I will say, like, all of these things, Heather and other members of the cast were bringing this up. And there's as the like director of the show, I was like, yes, I totally understand this. And I have no idea how to do this. Like, cause it was just like, how do we do a show, an improv show in particular, where everybody is in a different place? And there was like huge technical questions for that. There were like huge artistic questions for that. Just sort of like, for most people who are probably tuning into this, putting together a stage production generally is like a huge complicated thing that is like a lot of logistical pieces. And then doing that with people from like 8 different locations and then broadcasting that in real time, I did have a little bit of like heart palpitations for a little bit trying to wrap my head around it. But then, I mean, thankfully we figured it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think what I thought was interesting is that you guys settled on Zoom, and maybe this is like a little too tech wonky, but I mean, I think probably like many people, I've been on like 16 different chat services this way in the past couple weeks, right? Like I run the gamut, and one of the things that's so nice about Zoom is you can have a lot of participants that actually have pictures, right? Like some of them really top out. I was curious why you guys ended up with Zoom. Was it that somebody had an account, or was it just, did you actually go ahead and buy the pro version to keep it running longer, or is that why you guys are cycling through the pictures? Because I think it times out at 40 minutes.
Yeah, so we do have a pro account through some sort of borrowing of accounts that we have for other professional purposes.
Yeah,
I won't go into farther. But yeah, so that is important. Why Zoom? We looked at Zoom and we looked at Google Hangouts were the two that we were sort of exploring most. Honestly, it kind of was a time crunch thing where we looked at Google Hangouts and they had sort of like a lag time where it's like you had to sign up for it and then they had to approve you or something like that in order to like do some of the kinds of things that we knew we wanted to do, like having everybody in the chat at once. And so we were moving fast, like as we were trying to put this thing together, because it was like, okay, if we're going to do, this was, maybe on like the Thursday before the Monday show, if we're going to do this, we got to figure out how to get everybody in this format. We have to all practice it. We have to figure out how to broadcast it live. And so in the time that we sort of lost figuring out Google Hangouts, we were just like, okay, we're gonna practice and try with Zoom. And then it worked, right? Like, I think that it's worked well, Heather, right?
Yeah. I didn't explore any of the other options. So I mean, we can get into the artistic stuff. Like we had to figure out how to behave, how to work with the system once we chose the system.
Mm-hmm.
But the system seemed fine. It's easy. I mean, my mom, who hates technology, was able to log on and watch the show, and she's never even heard of Zoom, and apparently it was very easy. She's like, oh, I just had to sign up or log in or whatever. And usually she's of the age that's afraid of logging in or clicking any buttons.
Well, and to be clear, one of the functionalities that Zoom offered that it's possible Google or some of the other services do, but I knew I had someone who could help me figure it out on Zoom, was taking the Zoom that we're doing live and then live broadcasting it to our Facebook Live and our YouTube page. And so that functionality of like both being able to do the show live or do it in the program and have it sort of talk to the other tubes, as I keep saying, like, and spit it out that way was a really valuable functionality for us. And thankfully so all of the University of Minnesota is all in on the Zoom. And so I knew someone who worked at the University of Minnesota who had already explored this some, and she basically was able to send me a little tutorial of like, here's how you take a Zoom and you put it on YouTube. And that, even though it still took me about 3 days to figure out, like it was very thankful and helpful. And I need to make sure that she gets a bonus from her boss or something if I have that. I'm going to just write a nice letter.
Sorry, there's a weird lag on my time, but I think it's finally back. You're finally moving a little bit more normally. Sorry. Technology, right? There we go. Everyone wishes that they would have boosted their internet a while back. So I'm curious then, did you think that was really important? I noticed that the way that you were taking comments from the audience was via Twitter. So it seemed like it was very important to be able to do to post it live, right? To have it streaming directly to Facebook, and then to have sort of that instant feedback from viewers as you were going through. And was Twitter just like the best mechanism? Were you also looking at Facebook as you were doing it?
Yeah, we did a variety of things. So we had people commenting, probably most like often as you're suggesting on Twitter, but there were also comments under the Facebook Live video. I had a few people who were watching and had my cell phone number and just texted me during the show. I had at least one lady who wrote me an email, which was, I don't know exactly what she was thinking because I couldn't like close my computer in order to open the email and to read it or whatnot. But you know, we're all learning. We're all getting there. It's fine. So, and I mean, so there's also a part of this that I would just say like, I appreciate the question in terms of like, oh, you thought about this and chose the wisest course of action, when really a lot of this was just like, oh crap, we got to figure this out. Like, what can we do like tomorrow? Quick, that works, try that, like put that on there. And that was sort of how a lot of things started happening. And then, I don't know, it's very improv-y that way where you just sort of say like, is this working? Yes. Okay, let's go with it and build on it.
Yes, improv tech, exactly. Well, so maybe we could go into a little bit. I want to definitely hit more of the performance notes, but just a few more questions. So, who was actually running the feed? Was it you, Tane?
Yeah. So I was running the feed in terms of the Zoom. And so one of the things, and we'll talk about more of this with the technical and the performance piece, but that we figured out is that whoever was like running the Zoom, like the host who is then broadcasting it, it's their screen that people see primarily, the people at home.
Yes.
And so that was me. And I had at least one person who must have been watching very closely who noticed that, you know, every once in a while I would have to lean over and then hit some buttons and things like that in order to make it work. So that was one, but then we had our communications person, Destiny, who she was the one who was watching like the Facebook and the Twitter, and also sort of just monitoring that the whole thing didn't crash. right? Like that didn't happen. But if that had happened, like we had just gone offline, I don't know if I would have known that necessarily unless she were watching that. Again, she's watching that from another place entirely. Like, and so I guess she would have like called me and been like, hey, you all are still doing a show that nobody's watching anymore. But thankfully that didn't happen. So yeah.
And then would you be the one who was selecting who was, because as you go through, oftentimes like you're going back and forth like full screen from the different performers. So was that just the built-in functionality of Zoom, like highlighting the box of whoever was speaking, or did you actually have to toggle it yourself?
So for the most part, that's just Zoom. Zoom, this is one of the things that Zoom is really smart and cool about, is that it knows who's talking, and then it can flash back and forth between the two. And so it did that for the most part. There were a couple places where, like, one of the things, and again, we'll go to more of the artistic and technical side of this, that we figured out is like, okay, because of that functionality, you have to be very careful that people are not talking at the same time, or, you know, in the beginning part of the show where I'm introing things or whatnot, we have to make sure that like only I am making noise, because if anybody else, like any of the cast or the guest made noise, then the screen would cut over to them. And so how do we make sure that that happens? But for the most part, and so there were a couple places where you can do a functionality in Zoom that's called pin the video, and it basically just makes it so that there's one video that is the video and it's not going to cut back and forth. And so I think I did that once or twice, like at the beginning maybe, but otherwise it was pretty much just the functionality of Zoom. And I'll stop there and we can talk more about that.
Yeah, well, maybe let's shift a little bit into the actual performance. I'm curious about, I have a couple of questions. You can answer them in any order you want. Was the structure like very similar to your normal show, or was it different? Like, did you have to do different things to like kind of take advantage of the affordances of the digital medium? Did you have more rehearsal time or less for this show, depending, or as opposed to some of the other ones that you've done? And did you actually already pair the scene partners together? Like, did people know who was going to be part of the different scenes? Or was it really like, I'm sitting here talking and like, I hope someone joins in and nobody can read my body language, and I really like, hello, like I hope someone comes into the scene with me.
I'll jump in.
Yeah, you go.
There were a lot of great questions there. I'll just start from the last one. Because we were just talking about the natural functionality of Zoom. We did not plan who was in a scene, and that is so wonderfully improv that Zoom has that improv thinking. So we, just as a heads up, what Tane is seeing, I don't know what Tane is seeing. What the audience is seeing is, I'm watching it in gallery view, so I can see all participants at all times. So it's not just one at a time. So I can see all my fellow players. And if I start a scene and start talking, I can see if someone's going to join or not. On the other side, I can also see when someone has started a scene, but they haven't started talking. So we know that Zoom's not on them. So there's a little bit of adjustment in that way. In improv, I could enter a scene and never say a word, but you know I'm in the scene. On Zoom, I could start a scene, but if I'm just doing that, no one's going to see it because of that functionality of Zoom. So we didn't plan the partnerships. We did rehearse more than for this one show than any single show, because we had to practice of, you just have to think auditorily to work with the Zoom functionality so that people know you're in a scene, and also practice not talking at the same time, which is the most human thing we all do. So we worked on that, and we worked a lot about like, well, when do you mute? Well, when I leave the scene, or when I hold up my new scene, which is completely new for Zoom, I need to go to mute, because if I make a sound, it's gonna stay on me or whatnot. So it was so interesting, art with technology moments and embracing it. But the cool thing that Zoom has, which improv doesn't and theater doesn't, theater, you're always in the same frame. So, you can see the actors, whatever, but in Zoom, it's like you get to improvise a movie. So you can like get in here and like do scenic bits with your frame, where in improv, you don't have that, or in live theater, you don't have that. So you really can control that element of cinematography that we don't ever get to do in live theater, which is a cool thing that we're still even discovering as we all discover this new world of like, what are the assets we have and what are the limitations we have?
And I just want to, because there's a lot in there, but one of the really valuable things for anybody who's thinking about using the Zoom functionality is that basically trick of knowing you can have everybody watching the show, or sorry, everybody who's on cast, right? Like if you're imagining the cast like this, in that gallery view. And then you can have it so that what's broadcasting is just the person speaking. And this is like this was a huge sort of discovery for us, because it basically means that like for folks who are watching at home, if like Heather and I are doing a scene, the view from home is going to just flip back and forth between she and I speaking, like going back and forth between the two. Meanwhile, the other like 6 cast members and keyboardists can all have their gallery view open, where they have the little pictures of everybody else, and they can sort of be watching and getting ready and like sort of, it's limited because they can't talk to each other, but they can still like see each other and see like, okay, who's gonna like jump in next, or this person is like already making a face or like getting into a physical position where it looks like they're gonna do something, so I can jump in with them. And that's all basically like backstage, right? Like the audience isn't seeing that at all, which is a neat functionality. And as Heather said, something that we're still like playing with and learning what all we can do with that. Heather, the other piece I was going to ask you that I heard some of the cast talking about was with that. So there's the frame piece, like we're in this box, and that's cool. But then there's also with some stuff that I know you all were saying like, okay, you have to be characters sort of differently in this than you might on stage, right?
Yeah, there's an element of subtlety that doesn't come across, which I think is so unexpected, because in film acting, subtlety is what it's all about. So where this, at least for improv and for improv comedy in this way, I'm sure other groups can do it in a different way. Because what we're doing is the improv form a montage. So we're pulling a new scene in. You kind of need to be a little bit of a character because you don't have all of your physicality to tell the story. So if I wanted to be someone and a different age, if I'm a child, I can't just get short because you don't know what that is. So I might need to get closer, further away, a voice, a physicality, like something, because it's a visual medium, it's not just a radio play. So something to think about, well, if you're going to cut 3/4 of your storytelling body away, which is your legs and your movement and your stillness and sitting down or standing up or picking up a thing, like you can't even do space work. Like it's only in here. So thinking about how to amplify the 1/4 of your body that you have. And because we're so technology savvy that we also know if it's not engaging to watch and just to hear, people will wander away, which is fine, because that is also a joy of this, is now people can do their laundry and watch a T2P2 show. But you also, like, if you have this visual medium, use it and like explore the opportunities it has.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay. So my question then, so is everybody, so you guys can all see each other in the gallery view. Are people muting themselves and then unmuting, or is everybody unmuted the whole time?
We're mute.
Can you also see that as well?
Unmute. And then when you are not in the scene, completely mute, because you don't know if someone's kid or cat or dishwasher will take the focus.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you don't want to cut to someone strange because they're making a sound.
I'm like, oh, that was my fridge.
Heather, can you tell? I actually don't know. Can you tell if the other performers are muted or not?
Yeah. In gallery view, there's the little microphone.
Yeah.
And it has the red, like, can you see it? I'll mute right now.
Oh, yeah.
And in gallery view, the names stay up, I think. Yeah. Like where I'm in gallery view with the three, I'm not, again, technology and Zoom. So we can tell, so it's hard to like, and we do have a chat window. So if someone is unmuted and they haven't realized it, you can just be like, hey, you're not muted. Or or sometimes people forget to unmute themselves and they think they're in a scene, which is also.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So a couple other things I know that we sort of figured out. Heather mentioned this, but again, to just really underscore, one of the interesting artistic pieces of this is that you can't talk at the same time. And as Heather said, like, that's just a very natural thing. And yet, even when we're doing, you know, good improv on stage in a live audience, we usually try and say, like, don't step on each other. Let the other person say their thing. And yet this format just 100% demands that, because even in this chat we're all having right now, the couple of times where we sort of talked at the same time, like, oh, there's no focus. Like the audience can't see anything almost, like, or follow any thread. And it doesn't work for me to just try and be louder than you or something like that, which is kind of a jerk thing to do anyway. So, I mean, that's a really interesting thing, because it then, in subtle and explicit ways, changes the pacing to some degree. Because, like, I have to wait for you to completely finish your line before I start talking. Right, Heather? Is that sort of how you felt it?
Yeah, and it's also the behavior of, I have to stop talking.
Yeah.
Improv is such a cool environment and art form because it's completely inventive at the moment. And on stage, when you don't know what people are doing, you can think that you just need to fill space. Or you're just doing such cool improv stuff, you might want to do a 5-minute monologue. That may not be what quite fits into what our show is doing with Theater of Public Policy, but it's also training yourself of, I trust that my partner is there and listening if I just need to stop talking.
Yeah. And you'll notice even in this meeting, I think we're doing this thing a little bit where I will just say, Heather, like, and like, because there's also a piece, and that this was true in the show to some degree as well. Like, you have to just be more explicit and deliberate in certain aspects, because it's the only way to pass it off directly. Like Heather was saying, if I'm done talking, I can't say, and I am done talking and I'm going to stop now. And like, because it just doesn't work. Like, you have to like stop and be like, if you're going to ask a question, be like, Heather, what do you think about that? And then just stop.
Artistically, something, just what Tane was saying, we found that with improv is all about relationships, and it's even more important. I mean, it's always important, but in the Zoom or on the online, of saying, mom, doctor, like calling that other person in so that somebody knows to enter. In rehearsals, I remember I did a scene where I was a small child who was having a hard time with parents and then the alligator salesman, but I would just call for a new character, and then we would have another new character appear, because on stage, I probably wouldn't have needed, because people could have just joined, but because of the nature that we're using this innate function of the auditory drives who's being seen, I needed to tell someone to enter, just to be clear, just so they know it's the same scene, it's not a new scene. In improv, we have a lot of physical mechanics, like people run across the stage and swipe the scene away to start a new scene. Or you can have people enter. So it's all about being clear, which, as I speak in a roundabout way, is ironic and funny.
No, I mean, I think that makes sense, because you are also, and you had like the next scene pieces, right? So that people kind of know, like, okay, like, I think we're done.
Yeah.
But I mean, in improv, and maybe this is just my ignorance speaking, who actually ends the scene? Is it the people in the scene, or is it the people who are like, oh, I think you guys are done, like hook? Because it's interesting, because you guys actually were ending your own scenes, right? Is that the way it typically works?
That is, that's a great question. Typically, it's the team that the other people who aren't in the scene will edit it, because you don't necessarily need to think about ending the scene you're in, because you're focused. However, in improv, you can also end your own scenes. Traditionally, we have a music edit. It's called an edit when they just edit to the next scene. Dennis usually plays, so he does a lot of so usually it's externally edited from the people not in the scene. maybe 20% of the time internally. However, this requires a lot more of the people inside who are acting their hearts out to also think about, has this scene told its story, to also edit it, because that is a functionality that is a new challenge in the Zoom format.
Right, because normally, as Heather was saying, in a lot of our work, we have the gift of having a musical director, keyboardist on stage with us, and so in a lot of our traditional shows, he would edit those. It doesn't work, we've learned, basically, in Zoom, because if he starts playing, there's a little bit of a lag, or if he's playing and somebody else is speaking, then the shot is going to go back and forth between the two. And so we made the deliberate decision to have, as you saw, like, basically the cast hold up things that were either like new scene or blackout or end of show. Yeah, like something like that, new scene. And then Dennis, our keyboardist, who was part of the show, would then sort of play a bumper to like transition to the next scene, but it was internal that way. I want to say my number one tip thing for Zoom that we learned from doing this, and I think is a really valuable tip, whether you're doing theater or just your Zoom meetings for whatever reason, which is that standing up makes such a huge difference versus sitting down. So we're all doing, like, you know, we're all doing Zoom meetings all the time, and 95% of us probably or more are always just sitting at our office desk, and that's probably fine for a lot of meetings. But I'm telling you, try it once, like set yourself up where you can like stand up while you're at a meeting or doing one of these Zoom things, and it completely changes your own energy and how you interact with it, and you have like a freedom to this that you just don't have when you're sitting down, right, Heather? We figured this out.
Yeah, we definitely, our first rehearsal, I think we were sitting, or similar. And there's also some incredible tips going around that you forwarded from like another improv facility that has been creating this nationwide as well. I like to think of it as, think of yourself as the remote reporter on the scene, and they're always standing and they're always aware of what's behind them. And they're also aware of like what they're wearing. Like, look how great this blue contrasts with this yellow. Like, you're not too distracted, even though my walls are very colorful and I have a whole window. But it's about like, look at you, making it clear so that people aren't distracted. Like, what is on the top of Heather's fridge? I mean, that is a tin. But just like thinking about what's behind it. But like, I like to think about that action reporter, like they're ready to go, they're doing their thing, but if something happens, they're also ready to be like, oh, the milkman has arrived. And so they're always ready through the standing up. That's how I'm approaching all these Zoom meetings.
What, wow. What news station is that is covering when the milkman arrives? Like,
I mean, it's a whole new world. The milkmen are coming back to deliver milk.
They are. They're an essential service.
They are an essential service.
Okay, so I guess I have maybe one more question for you guys.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I think it's me. My internet is so bad. Can you guys still hear me?
Oh yeah, we can hear you perfectly well. You pause every once in a while, which I just find being very dramatic before you ask your next question.
Yes. If I stand like this, I can cover up both of my outlets.
Oh, Erin is texting. Hey, my internet is terrible. You're fine.
We can hear you. I wrote that.
You're just taking...
Okay, maybe it's better. I don't know. My last question for you is what... Oh, I'm taking dramatic pauses. Yes, thank you. My last question is, what are you guys going to change up? Because as you said, you're going to have a performance every Monday in April. So what sorts of learnings are you going to incorporate into your next performances?
Well, I think a lot and also not a ton. I think thinking about it as like you're doing a tiny movie and thinking about different kind of visuals within without having to move your computer around the house. Like we did some puppet work, which is something we also discovered of like the fun of the puppets that are nearby. Like, oh, here comes an invisible horse. The fun of that.
Right. And I would just, because that was an interesting piece, because traditionally, at least in our improv, and I think in a lot of improv, you wouldn't use a lot of props that way, right?
Or
like
any props.
Yeah, or any props. Like you wouldn't have puppets showing up in most improv shows unless that was explicitly what they were doing. But again, no, like, I don't know, it's the
Or the live cat.
Yeah.
Oh, my cat.
Yeah, Heather's cat made an appearance.
He showed up, he sat right here,
And again, like, so one, because that just sort of works with this technology and sort of the storytelling that this allows, but then also there's this really neat piece that we haven't talked a lot about that I'm fascinated by, which is the audience's relationship to this thing and the fact that it is so new and different. And the audience is not dumb. Like the audience gets like, this is not normal. This is different. They are doing this show in a way that is totally new for them and totally new for us. And they are, at least in our experience, like there and on board with it because they're like, oh my gosh, everything is weird and crazy right now. I am so grateful and happy that these folks are trying and experimenting with this thing. I'm like there with them and I want to see them try new things. And then I think that means they, at least in our experience again, give us permission to do things that are like breaking maybe what the expectation of what we normally would do is. Right, Heather? Like that's sort of how I felt.
Yeah, it's new for everyone. Audiences are very smart. And yeah, getting the relationship is new and there's something exciting and very improv about that too, of we're using a brand new medium, as many improv groups are doing, and the audiences are brand new audiences. It's almost like a subset of the art form. Like there's improv and then there's online improv.
Yeah.
And that's just grounds that are, and I know people have done it before, we all were forced to do it, but now everyone is kind of like, this is the only way, this is the new normal, to use that phrase that is so commonly said. It's exciting for the audience and for the performers and creators and artists to think, well, what is this? What we're seeing happen in full force right now.
And you asked about what are new elements of this that we're going to do. So one thing in our first show, the first show that we did, the one about birds that you saw, is we had one guest that I was, so as you noted at the top, our usual structure is that I interview a guest and then that is the inspiration for the cast to craft improv from. And so in that first show, we had one guest who was talking, she and I had a conversation. Even in that, I had a little bit of learning curve because my interview style for folks who've seen the show is traditionally like very sort of conversational and usually very much like in it with somebody and we're kind of going back and forth pretty quickly. And again, even though Zoom is very good, you can't do that. Like you can't sort of jump in right as somebody's saying something interesting and be like, oh, wait, say more about that. Because even if there's a half-second delay or they just don't catch it, like it pulls it apart. So even as Heather was saying with the performance, same with the interview piece, you have to stop and wait for the other person to really finish. And there were even a couple of times, I would say, in the first show where I probably didn't do that perfectly, and you can kind of tell. And so practicing that is one thing. But then in this next show that we're going to do, we're going to have two guests instead of one, which I'm starting to think about, okay, how do I do that piece, that interview piece, which again, like there's lots of examples out there, but that facilitating a conversation and particularly thinking about it, we want our shows to feel like a conversation. Like I want the interviews that we do to feel like we are, you're eavesdropping on some people at like a dinner party or a cocktail hour or something like that, talking about this interesting thing, and not like, oh, this is sort of like a presentation at a conference and I'm just asking a question and then each person is going down the line and answering that. So how do we try and maintain it feeling like a conversation and feeling like people just talking as regular humans, knowing that we still have to pace it to work with the technology, and there's now two people, so you have to also probably be more deliberate about who is speaking when. And that's something that we'll keep practicing and experimenting with going into this next show. And then I think that basically from the performer standpoint, and I would throw it back to Heather on this, but is like building on the stuff that we figured out worked well in the first time, right? We figured out, as Heather said, characters like work really well if you're playing them with your face and within the frame and those kinds of things. Like the playing with things in the room is good and doing that up big, and then the just being very deliberate is really important.
Mm-hmm. And also just refining the functionalities of the mute and like creating the normal stuff again, where on stage we know the procedures and we know the best practices, and now it's finding and learning and remembering.
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, and I guess I have a final question for you guys, because you just have me thinking so much. Do you think you're going to see new audiences from this? Are you enticing people in who have maybe never seen a show of yours before? What's the sort of outreach strategy that you guys are working on?
Yes. We know already that there's a lot of people who are watching these shows that don't normally watch the shows for a variety of reasons. I mean, one is just geography, right? So there are people who are, we know in the first show that we did that there were people tuning in from Arizona and Florida and New York and the Dakotas, and those people would not normally like drive in to be at our show at the Bryant Lake Bowl in Minneapolis. So there's definitely that. There's definitely, this is something that I have mixed feelings about always as like a traditional theater person, which is that people are used to being able to watch things on demand whenever they want. And so even though we did this show live, they're both still available and archived on our Facebook and our YouTube channel. So anybody can go and watch them at any time. And so we also know there's a lot of people who just like watched it the next day or watched it later in the week or whatnot, which is not normally a function of our show. I personally think it's always better live, but anyway, I'm happy if anybody watches it at any time. So there's definitely things that way. And then, you know, there's just people who are like, I want to see something now in this weird time that feels good and fun. And I mean, one of the things that I also say, and this is an artistic choice for what we did with our show. I mean, we had already known we were going to do this show about birds, but even if we had it, like, we very much wanted to do something that was not explicitly like, we're going to talk about coronavirus or about quarantine or whatnot. Because it just, to me, it feels like there's plenty of that out there right now, right? Like, if we do an hour-long show, people can still get 23 hours worth of like nonstop like virus coverage and updates. And having 1 hour that is admittedly a distraction in some ways, but still an informative, intelligent, like you learn something distraction, I think is really helpful. And I got a ton of feedback from people who are just like, it was so nice to have something that was like live and communal, that I felt like I was part of like a community of people watching this thing. And it wasn't like, oh, we're watching sort of like a CNN report on what's happening in this state or something like that. And so that is, I think of that as sort of like a service that we can provide using our talents and our things that we are good at for people right now. And I think that that's useful and valuable, and I hope something we can keep doing for a long time.
I think that that's a good point. It's really easy to get quite myopic, but I mean, it's right there in your title, right? The Theater of Public Policy. And one of the scary things is when we're all distracted by coronavirus, by quarantine, it's hard to remember that like other things are actually still happening as well. Like we didn't hit pause necessarily on our government, right? Things are still like moving forward. And in fact, when people are distracted, that's when like really horrible things can get passed. So it's worth keeping in our thoughts, right? That we should be talking about other issues as well.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like, guys, this was so much fun. Thank you. I look forward to seeing your other productions. Is this correct? It looks like you've got one on disinformation coming up, on the Housing Commission, and on zoning and transit.
Isn't that so fun? Yes.
No, it's great.
It is. It's going to be great.
It's great.
Gonna be very fun. And so that is true. So basically, folks who are watching, every Monday in April, we are planning to do something, planning to do a show with a guest. And as you mentioned, the next one, we set up all about sort of how conspiracy theories get started and how we can combat those and have people have trust and faith in journalism and stuff like that. And so, and then, I don't know, what I always find is like, so you may be listening and being like, housing, zoning, that sounds boring. But then you have amazing people like Heather who are going to turn that into improv comedy.
I'm really, really looking forward to that one. I can't wait to see it. Guys, thank you so much. Have a nice day. Stay healthy. And we look forward to seeing you next one.
All right. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Erin.